Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon. I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of our staff and our friends at Third Place Books, it's a pleasure to welcome you tonight to our presentation of Jacob Mchangama and Carolyn Bick. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we are very glad you're here to join us tonight. Our presentation should run around 60 minutes, including Q&A. You can submit your questions anytime, frankly, they occur to you by using the URL meet.ps/Mchangama, and that's spelled M-C-H-A-N-G-A-M-A. You'll also see a QR code probably floating on your screen right now. You can just scan that with your smartphone and that will pop it up right for you. We'll put the link in the chat as well. So you submit yours when you feel like it. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, and we ask that you keep your own concise in order to facilitate that. Also, a reminder, if you'd like to view the program with closed captions, please click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include Tiffany Drayton discussing racism's impact on her family, and at the month's end, best-selling author Erik Larson discussing the public and personal life of Winston Churchill during World War II, as detailed in his new book, The Splendid and the Vile. His, by the way, is Erik Larson, not Winston Churchill's, but you understood that already. Visit our website to join our email list and get the latest updates, as we're adding stuff pretty much constantly throughout the season. Town Hall's programs are made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civics series is supported by the Real Networks Foundation and the True Brown Foundation. But as you likely know by now, since I say it virtually every introduction, Town Hall is at heart a member-supported organization, and we want to thank all of our members for joining us tonight. If you share their vision, our vision of a community that's strengthened through discussions of civics, science, and culture, we hope you'll consider supporting us by donating or becoming a member yourself. One last bit of infomercial. You will certainly want to go further into tonight's topic by purchasing your own copy of Jacob's book. Please use the link in the chat below to pick up your copy through Third Place Books, our wonderful local independent bookseller, one of our wonderful local independent booksellers. And with that, a lawyer, human rights advocate, and social commentator, Jacob Mchangama is the founder and executive director of Justitia, a Copenhagen-based think tank focusing on human rights, freedom of speech, and the rule of law. From February 2018 to February 2020, Mchangama wrote and narrated a serial podcast, Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech, and his writing on the topic has also appeared in The Economist, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and other outlets. He was formerly chief legal counsel for the Center for Political Studies, a free market conservative think tank, also based in Denmark. Carolyn Bick is a reporter and visual journalist for the South Seattle Emerald, covering police accountability, COVID-19, grassroots community betterment, and local politics. Their work has appeared on Yahoo Finance, Al Jazeera, Boston.com, and in the Puget Sound Business Journal and the Boston Globe, and many others. Mchangama's book, Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media, is the subject of their discussion tonight. Please join me in welcoming Carolyn Bick and Jacob Mchangama.
Hello.
Hello.
All right. Shall we get started?
Yes.
All right. Fantastic. So I am not sure how many of the audience members have been able to pick up your book, but if possible, since you have a lot to say on the subject, if you could potentially provide a brief overview of what you wrote about and also the history of it. I mean, it's obviously quite a lengthy and weighty subject, free speech, but if you could talk about a little bit how it developed differently in different cultures and countries and the common threads among them, that would be great.
Yeah. So I would say that the available evidence suggests to us that for much of human history, speech codes have been adopted to protect the rulers from their subjects and not the other way around. And free speech is a very counterintuitive and atypical development. In many ways, you could perhaps argue that human beings have evolved, our software that we come with have evolved with a default mode of intolerance. And then we've developed this little patch called free speech and tolerance on top of that, but it has to be constantly guarded and updated so that our default mode doesn't override it and back into intolerance. But where I locate free speech as the first sort of part of the political system and a cultural trait is the Athenian democracy that originated some 2,500 years ago. By the standards of the day, not by our standards, it was a radically egalitarian democracy in the sense that freeborn male citizens had a direct voice in the laws that were adopted, so they could debate and vote directly. But perhaps even more importantly, they also had the concept of called parousia, which means something like uninhibited speech, so that everyone could participate in the public debate, and they prided themselves, the Athenians, of their tolerance, the ability to mock the high and mighty, to even poke fun at the gods, even though, as Socrates found out, there were limits to this tolerance. Now, this contrasted with just about everywhere else, and especially the bitter rivals of the Athenians in Sparta. So we have this famous orator called Demosthenes, and he said, in Athens, you can criticize the Athenian constitution and praise the Spartan constitution, but if you're in the oligarchic Sparta, you're only allowed to praise the Spartan constitution, and you can't say anything positive about the Athenian constitution. And I think that still is a sort of a succinct definition of free speech, sort of the litmus test. Can you criticize the political system under which you live? Now, the Athenian democracy obviously did not live on forever. It went through a series of crises. It was overthrown by oligarchs who, as their very first move, overthrew democracy. It came back, but ultimately it went downhill. And then free speech was also part of the Roman Republic, but in a more elitist version. So it was more of a top-down approach to free speech. Elites, the well-born, well-educated exercise free speech, not so much the plebs, the unwashed mob. And as we maybe can get back to, these two concepts of free speech, an egalitarian and elitist one, has been in tension throughout the history of free speech. But before we sort of really develop a concept of free speech as such, it takes a while. So we really have to get into, get sort of nuggets of free speech theory in the late 16th century, but really we have to get into the 17th century, where you have people like the Levelers in England, who are sort of radically egalitarian proponents of early democracy. You have someone like Spinoza in the Dutch Republic, who also argues for free speech. And then, of course, with the Enlightenment, free speech becomes a very popular idea all of a sudden, until the French Revolution occurs, and then suddenly free speech is seen as a harbinger of everything that is bad, and Europe in particular goes into a very long period of sort of reactionary backlash against free speech, which even makes it to the US with something like the Sedition Act. We might get back to that, but I think ultimately free speech is never completely won or lost. It's a battle to and fro, and I think there's a lot of recurring patterns in the arguments that are used to counter free speech, and why people will say, well, free speech is important, but we need to limit this or those that, depending on your position and outlook. And I would say that, and acknowledge that free speech comes with harms and costs. So free speech is not only a good principle; it can be used for harms. But it is an experiment. No one can sort of guarantee the outcome of free speech, that it will always be positive. But I think that looking back at history, I would argue that free speech has been a very beneficial experiment that is worth continuing, and that if we sort of erode the cultural foundations on which free speech ultimately depends, our world will be a lot less free, tolerant, equal, and progressive, really.
I really appreciate you being able to so very quickly tie that up with the bow, because there are so many things that you said that obviously weave in throughout your book. And I did think it was a really interesting point that you called free speech still an experiment, because I think that in quite a few countries, including the United States, we like to pretend that we have it all figured out and that it's always perfect, but that's not actually the case. And it doesn't matter whether it's written down on a piece of paper, people still find loopholes and ways to hamstring free speech, even in our so-called, progressive democracy of America. And I wanted to get your take on, how not just the US is doing right now with free speech, but also other Western countries, and then, extending further than that, places in the Middle East like Saudi Arabia, and places like China or Japan. Any of those places, really. There are common threads, but I definitely want to hear you talk about more about them.
Yeah, so I think there's one way to look at it, with sort of through a positive view, a positive spin on the state of free speech today, is that we're living in a golden age. So if you go back some 100 years, not even several hundred years, but there was 100 years in this country, in the US. If you were a socialist and you were opposed to American involvement in World War I, sort of just about 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, you could be sent to prison 10 or 20 years, and the Supreme Court would say, oh yeah, the First Amendment doesn't protect that. Right where I'm sitting close to Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. And in 1917, you had a number of women's rights activists who were burning an effigy of President Woodrow Wilson because they wanted the right to vote. And they were arrested. They were carted off, arrested, and fined. Today, I was living in New York in 2018, and with my family, we went into a museum. When we went out from the museum with my kids, tens of thousands of women were protesting, demonstrating against the president, wearing pink pussy hats and shouting obscene things at the president. And the NYPD was there to protect them and their right to speech. So that's obviously a sign of huge progress. That but if you take a more negative view, I would say that we're living that the golden age is in decline. So we live through a free speech recession. We see that in authoritarian states, China as the most egregious example, but Russia is another example where Putin's stranglehold on Russian politics depends very much on him killing, imprisoning journalists, and so on. You also see it in sort of illiberal democracies in Europe, like Hungary and Poland, where, for instance, laws limiting the free speech of LGBT plus activists are being used increasingly to further sort of intolerant agendas. But you also see it in liberal democracies. My own country, Denmark, Germany, which has a more militant democratic tradition, sort of where you see democratic governments who no longer view free speech as to the free speech in the 90s, after the end of the Cold War, in the early 2000s, free speech was seen as a very positive value, was sort of the foundation of democracy. Today, I think there's a tendency to view free speech as also constituting a threat, especially with social media and the internet. And I would say in the US, free speech has probably never enjoyed a stronger legal protection under the First Amendment against the government. Of course, there are exceptions of national security issues where we've seen journalists come into hot water. But in general, you can say you really have to make an effort to be convicted for your opinions in the US. But I would argue that the cultural foundations of free speech in the US is under pressure from both sides, if you want me to sort of generalize. So there's an idea among people on the left that free speech entrenches unequal power relations and is being used to target minorities, sort of to punch down, and therefore, in order to ensure equality, in order to ensure the equal dignity of oppressed minorities, free speech needs to be limited. On the other hand, you see now, especially, you basically see a tsunami of of Republican-sponsored bills to target so-called critical race theory that is not only limited to K-12, but even into higher education, and also in certain states, sort of copy-pasting Hungarian, Polish attempts to sort of limit what can be said about LGBT plus issues in, you know, that cannot be raised in education, for instance. And I think ultimately, you know, the First Amendment was adopted in 1791. The wording hasn't changed, but you know, as I mentioned, in 1917, you could be arrested if you were advocating for the right to vote as a woman. Today, that would be unthinkable. But if the cultural foundation of free speech is undermined, then I think the legal protection will ultimately also be eroded. And that's why I think it's a dangerous moment in this country right now with the political polarization, where people are unable to sort of look at free speech as a principle and distinguish it from those who exercise it. Because, you know, in open democracies, when you champion free speech, most of the time it's about holding your nose and sort of defending the principle, but that does not mean that you agree with the statements by the persons who exercise free speech, their right to free speech. So that was a long sort of answer to your question.
No, actually, honestly, it was going to be my second question to you, or well, third, I suppose, question to you was going to be, you know, how do we see that in this country? And it's not just from one side, and you covered that perfectly. And so I did want to ask, you know, given what we're seeing from certain parties, and right now I am thinking obviously of Donald Trump, classic example currently for the current age. But then also more recently with the push to deplatform Joe Rogan for spreading misinformation about COVID, using the N-word multiple times on his podcast, just going wholesale, doing some not so great things, let's put it that way. Should there be limits to stuff like that, especially when they are such, you know, powerful figures? I mean, for all intents and purposes, Trump started and has not bothered to brook or stop a wave of massive amounts of misinformation regarding COVID. And one could argue that, in fact, his rhetoric around the virus is part of why we're in the situation we're in now.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring that up. So let me mention sort of two different poles. So during Trump's presidency, he obviously, as you know perfectly well, attacked the media as sort of enemies of the people, and it was sort of the fake news media. And there was a poll that was published in The Economist, and it said, and this was in 2017, where Trump was also talking about opening up libel laws, which in the US under the First Amendment is a really high bar before public officials can sue someone like you when you write critical things about those who so you enjoy a high degree of protection, whereas in previous times, if you wrote an article and that you might have gotten one little factual thing wrong, you could be sued, and that would be crippling, especially if you weren't sort of working for the New York Times. So that would and there was a plurality of Republicans, 43%, who supported the president being given powers to punish media who were engaged in biased or inaccurate information. Now that, you know, so if that had been, you know, passed during Trump's presidency, that would mean that Trump could have gone after, you know, the Washington Post or the New York Times, or, you know, any of the media that daily, CNN probably high on his list, that daily attacked him. And you know, of course, some of the stories that were published about him turned out not to be accurate. There obviously have been cases, you know, where sort of people have been writing stuff about him that was not factually accurate. So he could have used that. Whereas Democrats were opposed to giving the president the power, but in 2021, Democrats are now in favor of the federal government and tech companies being given more powers and doing more about curbing misinformation, whereas Republicans are completely skeptical about it. And I think this shows the danger of giving of sort of having centralized command and control of information. So I would argue that in these cases, the cure is worse than the disease when it comes if you try to use censorship and restriction to limit it. And there's a very interesting case for my own country, Denmark, where which has scrapped all restrictions. And the Danish health authorities have had to put up an English language web page to counter misinformation. And this is misinformation spread primarily by American blue check Twitter profiles with sort of the ones that argue for strict restrictions, because COVID has become part of the culture war in America. It doesn't fit the narrative that there's a country that has scrapped restrictions and that just seems not to be falling into chaos. So who gets to decide? Is it the Danish health authorities that are spreading misinformation, or is it blue check Twitter in the US? And if the solution is to sort of that Twitter or Facebook should restrict misinformation, who should they restrict, and who should decide it ultimately? This is, of course, always the burning question when it comes to free speech and restrictions. Who gets to decide, and do we trust the ones who get to decide? Because all human beings are unfortunately fallible, likely to fall into the trap of confirmation bias, and I would trust very few of us to be able to enforce the red lines completely objectively and without regard to our sort of underlying preferences and ideologies and so on.
And so then it's there, because as you just mentioned, there's such a fine line, and honestly, obviously, a lot of the misinformation regarding COVID and what people should do and shouldn't do, there are a lot of external factors on that too, but there's a fine line, as you just pointed out, between too much restriction and, I guess, honestly, not enough restriction. And that's the question. Should there be restrictions on free speech? And if so, what does that balance look like in order to facilitate progress within society, but not let every Tom, Dick, and Harry run around with a blue check on Twitter and say, hey, COVID's not a big deal, you're not going to die?
Yeah, and I think it's an unenviable task for anyone. Also because the science just develops, and lots of sort of health authorities have been wrong, not because they've been paid by Bill Gates and the Soros Foundation to enslave people, but just because it's something that we haven't been confronted with, and the science is developing, and science is a progress where you test various hypotheses, and you're working around the clock, and scientists get a lot of things wrong, or they get it partially right, and you don't who has the ability to fact check that in real time? Not a lot of people. So I can understand why Facebook and Twitter would remove something like someone who says, drink bleach, to cure COVID. But sort of you can get into all kinds of other things, discussions. I'm someone who's double vaccinated and boosted. But I also have 2 kids, and they're vaccinated as well. But I think we should be able to have a discussion whether the benefits outweigh the potential risk. I think that's a discussion that no one should sort of fact check they should fact check it, but no one should sort of have the ultimate say. Also because who knows, maybe in 5 years we will have learned things about COVID that we will accept as facts, that we were wrong, that our thinking on certain issues might be wrong now. So that's why, and there's actually a very interesting report by the Royal Society, which is Britain's leading scientific organization, and they explicitly argue that deleting content is not only inefficient but also counterproductive. So it might actually help to erode trust in scientific institutions, also just because of the inherent uncertainty that is involved in science. Of course, there are other categories. I thought, for instance, that during the January 6th attack on the Capitol, I thought it was the right thing to deplatform Trump during that moment, because it was, at the time, it was a violent attack on the peaceful transfer of power, and he did not choose to use his position as the most powerful man in the country to calm things down. So I thought, but I also thought it was problematic that it was a decision with no real basis in the terms, and that it was sort of an indefinite suspension. And of course, then you get into the whole, I have strong views about Donald Trump, but then, there are other world leaders who I think have done worse things than Donald Trump to their populations, and who have a megaphone on Twitter. So you get into sort of the question of, should Trump be banned forever? Whereas sort of the Iranians leaders who engage in sort of genocidal rhetoric and extreme speech and all kinds of issues, that's fine. But in general, I tend to be sort of very much on the side who says that any viewpoint it should not be, especially by the government, should not be punishable unless there's sort of an incitement to a real tangible harm, which means that I would also allow sort of racist speech. I don't think racist speech should be punished. And one of the reasons is that I think that the history of free speech shows that free speech has been perhaps one of the most powerful engines of human equality that we've ever stumbled upon as a species. And I think American history in particular shows this. So maybe the most draconian restrictions on free speech were adopted in southern states in the 1830s as a response to abolitionists who targeted the South with pamphlets, sort of appealing to whites to saying, that slavery could not be justified. And take a state like Virginia. So Virginia is the first state that adopts a Bill of Rights, a state Bill of Rights in June 1776, even before the Declaration of Independence, which says that the press freedom is the bulwark of liberty. But then in 1836, Virginia passes a law which makes it a crime to deny that white masters have a right to property in their black slaves, and also makes it a crime to encourage resistance to slavery, along like a whole laundry list of laws that are basically just their clear purpose is to defend the institution of slavery against criticism. And there's a number of southern states who do the same. In some of them, they adopt the death penalty. I don't think it was actually enforced, but we have examples of someone in Alabama who was prosecuted for writing that slavery was against the Bible. It was against God's commands. And on the other hand, you had abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, who argued that the free speech was a very precious right, especially to the oppressed. And who said that free speech would defeat slavery. And I think he was right. I think the adoption of these extremely draconian laws in the South was an admission that you could not defend the institution of slavery in a free and open debate. If you were to give Frederick Douglass free passage into Virginia or Alabama, and he was allowed to debate with a prominent white slaveholder the institution of slavery, Frederick Douglass is going to kick your ass. There's no way you can win that argument against him. And I think they knew that the only way they could defend and justify the institution of slavery to themselves, to Southern community, was to try and limit sort of arguments against it. And unfortunately, of course, abolishment of slavery, there was still a very long period with Jim Crow laws. But the civil rights movement is one of the reasons why the First Amendment has, includes such a strong protection of free speech, because the civil rights movement won a number of landmark cases from the 50s into the early 60s, including New York Times versus Sullivan, which is the one that protects you from authorities if you write something they don't like. And John Lewis, late congressman and civil rights icon, famously said that without free speech and the First Amendment, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. And I think that story is often forgotten when people out of good intentions say, we need to prohibit racist or intolerant speech, is that restrictions on free speech will always be adopted and enforced by those in power, and they tend to, that democracies that will be majorities, and then they will typically be aimed at minorities. And in the beginning that might be something that you sympathize with, but then you take the bills that we see now in the South, and you see suddenly they target teaching slavery in the history of slavery in higher education. I mean, that's a backward step, a massive backward and dangerous step.
So this is actually a perfect question from an audience member that I thought follows up beautifully with this. Is it hard balancing your morals with freedom of speech? How do you navigate your personal feelings on the matter?
Of course, I have, like most people, I think most people are more likely to be governed by their feelings than sort of cold rationality. I think that's us as a species. So of course there are times where I feel sort of my veins sort of pulsating, and I feel sort of the urge, let's just shut this person down. It's a perfect, we can all understand. So if you're sort of defending peaceful civil rights activists who are in the South in the 50s and 60s, who are being attacked by police dogs and hosed down and beaten with clubs for just demanding equal justice. Free speech is a powerful, it really energizes us. But then fast forward to Charlottesville, and you see people standing in KKK uniforms, and then suddenly free speech seems like a very abstract principle. Why am I defending this person's right to free speech? And it becomes much more difficult to convince yourself that it is important. But that's why I think the history of free speech is good, because when you look throughout the history, it might be easier for you to remember why you're fighting for this principle, that you're not actually fighting to protect or sort of support the right of white supremacists to viciously attack minorities. That's not really what it's about, and that in fact free speech has been instrumental in the fight against white supremacy in order to support and strengthen the rights of minorities. And I think obviously in this country you still have huge issues when it comes to racism, when it comes to minorities, but nonetheless, if you look at attitudes towards interracial marriage, for instance, in 1958, it was 4% of Americans who could accept it. Today it's something like 94%. Today I was in Virginia with my wife. I guess in this country, I don't know if I would be considered black. In my country, we don't think about these issues so much. But my wife is a white European, and in 1967, a marriage between us in Virginia would have been against the law. So that's a huge sign of progress. You could say the same thing about same-sex marriages today. It's something like 70% of Americans, even a majority of Republicans, who support it. And that social change has not come about by censoring or punishing those who were against interracial marriages. It didn't come about by putting into prison bigots or homophobes or the like. It, to a very wide degree, I think, has come about through activism, which is defended by the First Amendment, by appeals to the common humanity through sort of a critical media shining the light on the fundamental injustice and inhumanity of treating groups differently based on the color of their skin or who they love, and that I think is much more powerful in changing attitudes than, you know, censoring people, which tends not to be to convince them. You know, putting people in prison or censoring them tends not to convince people that they're wrong, and in fact, in many ways, it has the opposite effect, creating this martyr effect and giving them more attention. So that's why I can convince myself that, you know, even when it comes to you know, white supremacists, I would not want the government to punish or restrict their views. But I also think that if you have such a strong position on free speech as I do, you have a moral obligation to use your own free speech to condemn those views. So if I was to say, you know, I believe this white supremacist has a right to free speech, I would also very vehemently use my own freeze to denounce those views. And also I think you also have a moral obligation to lend support to those minorities who might feel a disproportional burden of hate speech leveled against them. And I think that's a part of the equation as well. If you just say free speech is great, but don't also use your own speech to counter hatred and show your support and solidarity with those who are the target of hatred, then I don't think the advocacy of free speech is as effective as it could be.
So another question from an audience member is, what specifically is if people take nothing else away from your book, what is the main point you want to get across? And do you feel you offer a new perspective that hasn't been talked about in the realm of free speech, which, as you mentioned in your book, has literally been occurring, the experiments has been occurring for thousands of years across hundreds of countries?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that there's been another book that covers the same time span. And also, I also cover non-Western events. So I cover, for instance, apartheid South Africa, how British colonialism used censorship to clamp down on anti-colonial movements, how religious tolerance in the Mughal Empire in India was a big thing. So I don't think that has been treated in the same volume or in the same book before. But I think, you know, one of the things that I don't know if it's unique, but so this idea of egalitarian versus elitist free speech, I think is a very something that I hope people will find persuasive and a takeaway. So that's one sort of and sort of the broad defense of egalitarian or free and equal speech with its roots in the Athenian democracy is something which I hope is contributes to a new perspective on free speech. But I wouldn't be I wouldn't claim that I've sort of created a whole new perspective on free speech and offering arguments that have never ever been heard before, because there are lots of people who have thought about free speech before. But hopefully I can sort of show the broad span of the history of free speech and provide perspectives for the past through that we can better understand through the prism of the past.
And you mentioned something I've been dying to ask you, but I definitely want to ask some audience member questions first. In my opinion, one of the most fascinating portions of your book regarding attacks on free speech was the portion called Elite Panic. I was wondering if you could potentially explain for listeners and viewers what you mean by that phrase and how it plays into free speech, or sorry, rather anti-free speech ideology.
Yeah, so it goes back to this idea of egalitarian versus elitist free speech. And so what we see, a recurrent theme throughout the history of free speech, is that every time the public sphere is expanded, either through new technology, so that could be the printing press, it could be the radio, the telegraph, or through political development, so extending the right to vote to the poor and propertyless, to women, to racial and religious minorities, those who are in power, who act as sort of the institutional gatekeepers to the public sphere, are afraid of the effects of giving, say, the unwashed mob a voice in public affairs, because women, minorities, and others are too credulous, fickle, or dangerous to be given a voice. It has to be the learned elite that sort of acts as the gatekeeper to keep the public sphere responsible. And we see that, I think, today. In the 1990s, I think most democracies were sort of, there was this idea that the internet would bring free and equal speech to everyone, and that it would be a force for unmitigated good, and censorship would be a thing of the past. That didn't quite play out this way, and today I think a lot of governments see the internet and social media as not necessarily a good, and something that needs to be contained. And so we have this tendency of elite panics, where elites try to say, oh, now we need to pass laws that force tech companies to police the internet, or we need laws that you see that in a number of European countries, for instance, that not only lawful speech but also harmful speech, and how do you define that, should be removed by tech giants, and that is nothing new. We've seen that again and again throughout history. So if you take Britain, for instance, one of my favorite persons in the book is a guy called Richard Carlile. And in the early 19th century, he spent a total of 6 years in prison for blasphemy and for the crime of selling Tom Paine's work, sort of Age of Reason, for instance, to the masses. So you were allowed to sell Tom Paine to the higher classes, but not the lower classes. And so the Attorney General explicitly says that, you can't, the lower classes have to be protected because against these attacks on religion and the political system, because they, unlike the rich and powerful, don't have the means to really interpret this. And the sort of the British class-based system with the rich and powerful at the top and the lower classes at the bottom is a political system that depends on the higher classes being able to sift through information and filtering down to the lower classes what is fit for them, as determined by the rich and powerful. And you see that in many instances throughout the history of free speech. And I think there's a desperate attempt again to try and reimpose some kind of top-down control by democracies today, which again is in some ways an understandable impulse, because there are, as I mentioned, harms and costs. I don't think January 6th could have happened without social media, for instance. So that definitely played a role. But again, the cure tends to be worse than the disease. So what kind of laws would you have had to pass to avoid a January 6th? I mean, how many different types of, so say you crack down on sort of deranged conspiracy theories about the election on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And then what about Telegram? What about Parler? What about all this? And how hard would you have had to crack down on people spreading these things in order for it to have been an efficient type of censorship? And that's why I think ultimately democracies have a hard time using effective censorship means. It's much easier for the Chinese because they don't have to pretend they care about free speech. They can just, clamp down on any type of speech, and they don't have to worry about it. But there are limits to what democracies can do without betraying their own principles, and also leaving behind precedents for those illiberals who would like to assume power and maybe use laws passed with good intentions to completely snuff out democracy. And in fact, I argue in the book that this is what happened in the Weimar Republic in Germany, where the Nazis ultimately used laws, democratic laws that were supposed to protect democracy, to abolish democracy. And so that to me is a dangerous precedent.
I would like to make the one point that some have speculated that if the FBI had done its job, January 6th wouldn't happen, and we wouldn't have needed any clampdown speech.
And I totally agree with that. I think, I think it was a Senate report, and it said that, one of the reasons why the FBI and Department of Homeland Security didn't do enough was the difficulty in distinguishing constitutionally protected speech from credible threats of action. But nonetheless, you could say, okay, we don't know whether this person says, bring your guns. Does he mean, is he serious, or is he sort of grandstanding on social media? Oh, let's not take a chance. So maybe we bring in a few more people to actually protect the Capitol, and that would not have entailed sort of censorship. It would just have entailed protecting the very heart of American democracy, where the peaceful transfer of power, which is pretty important in a democracy, was taking place. And then, police and security could have used legitimate force against those who tried to disrupt that, because obviously, free speech does not entail a right to violently attack the peaceful transfer of power. I don't think, well, some Republicans apparently try to argue that is the case, but I think, that is a pretty outlandish definition of free speech.
This last question from an audience member dovetails perfectly with that. Given how dizzyingly and increasingly effective computational disinformation has become at manipulating our cognition, does democracy still have a chance? How do we preserve free speech and protect our cognition from malicious actors?
Yeah, this is great, because after the 2016 election, there was this common narrative that the election was more or less decided by false information and disinformation favoring Trump. And I think there's been a lot, and this is very much part of the elite panic narrative. But there's a lot of really interesting research which shows that the share of disinformation on Twitter and Facebook is actually a lot less than sort of the common narrative, and also that it's not very effective. So those who stumble down the rabbit hole of MAGAism tend to be people who are already hardcore Trumpists. So it's not that, you put out sort of the MAGA gospel, and then suddenly liberal West Coasters turn into to members of the MAGA cult. Generally, it doesn't tend to work like that. But it became sort of when something like that happens completely out of the blue and which disrupts everything, you tend to look for easy explanations, and it's much easier to say, well, it was just sort of the masses were being manipulated by these platforms, and that's the reason why everything went to hell, when perhaps it's a much more complicated question and again, I'm not saying that disinformation online doesn't play a role, as the January 6th attack showed. It did. So but I would say at scale, disinformation may not be as efficient as some people think. But of course, if you are able to convince 2,000 people, that might be enough to attack the Capitol. But in general, I worry not so much about disinformation as sort of the common narrative, which sort of said that people were, and also this idea about echo chambers and filter bubbles has also shown in research that in fact people online tend to get more different perspectives than people who mostly get offline news. So there are lots of people, lots of problems with our with the digital ecosystem of information and opinion. But I think still we need to keep a perspective and not uncritically buy this idea that the mass of the population is simply being manipulated by fake news or disinformation. So in short, I think we can, but I would like to see ultimately a more decentralized information system, and also I think I'd like users to have more control themselves over content rather than Mark Zuckerberg sort of deciding on a whim, who gets to speak and who gets thrown off the platform.
I think that's a great point, and could you speak a little bit more? We have about 5 minutes or so. But before we wrap up and jump off, could you speak a little bit more about what a decentralized information system would look like, where Mark Zuckerberg does not have this, arbitrary authority that, Facebook so randomly applies?
Yeah, so I'm pretty old, so I remember the blogosphere, which was a much more decentralized internet, right? So no one would care about how a blog, even a very popular blog with hundreds and thousands of readers, no one would care about the comments that were allowed or not allowed because it didn't affect the entire ecosystem of information. And so we don't have the same discussions that we have today, where you have these huge centralized platforms who basically decide the practical exercise of free speech around the globe, and which has massive consequences. And I think sometimes we also tend to forget in wealthy established democracies, we fight about relative sometimes inconsequential things, but if you live in Nigeria or Russia, then where social media platforms can just be switched off. There are lots of countries where social media platforms are actually the only way you can really circumvent official propaganda and censorship. We don't have the same situation in democracies. So I think sometimes we're being a bit, we're showing a lack of solidarity when we demand sort of strict restrictions on free speech, because the consequences flow down and they affect people in illiberal democracies much more negatively than they do us. But so a decentralized, I think the most radically sort of decentralized ecosystem of information and opinion would be one where we had fewer of these big centralized platforms. So a bit back to the blogosphere. How that would come about, I have no idea. I'm just a lawyer. But hopefully there are people sitting somewhere in Seattle in a garage somewhere fiddling with something, and they'll sort of resist being bought up by Mark Zuckerberg before they launch a successful competitor. And hopefully there are many tinkering with great new platforms that can create a more healthy environment. But the other, I think, that is more feasible in the short term is, as I mentioned, sort of giving more control to users, because say you're a female journalist and you might have a disincentive to engage on social media because you're attacked with misogyny and so on. But that misogyny might not, first of all, there might be, you might have different limits on what you find offensive content. Also, the misogyny might not run afoul of legal limits on free speech. But if you were able to use a filter that was easy to click on and off, and that was not developed by Facebook, but perhaps a women's rights group, then you yourself would have much more control over what you were confronted with. But there might be other women who said, I actually want to see what misogynists are saying, so I don't want that filtered because I want to expose them, I want to counter them. You could say the same thing with anti-Semitism. Some people have a definition of anti-Semitism that stretches to sort of criticism of Israel or sort of boycotting Israel. Others would say, no, boycotting Israel is a legitimate criticism of Israel. And so you could have the ADL, which advances a very broad definition of anti-Semitism, could develop a filter that you could voluntarily apply, but not try to pressure Mark Zuckerberg or others to adopt ADL as a very broad definition, which then becomes the default for everyone and limits important discussions. So I think that's one sort of Solomonic solution, which I think is the only one that makes sense on big centralized platforms until we get back to the good old days of the blogosphere.
So you call yourself old, but I think I vaguely remember this also from my youth, various forums and blogs and what have you. But it's interesting that you should say that such tools could be implemented by outside groups and then voluntarily by users, because such technology does already exist. And this is going to seem like a very silly comparison, but I remember when the newest Star Wars movies started coming out, you could implement a tool, a blocker, if you wanted to block all spoilers for Star Wars. And so the fact that that still doesn't exist is a really good point that users can either implement or not. And I think that's, a good, I guess, wrap-up question then is, what's the ultimate danger of not moving more quickly to decentralize, limitations on free speech, especially on social media platforms, when clearly such technology already exists?
Yeah, I think the danger is that, Silicon Valley companies started out as these techno-utopian civil libertarians with free speech ideals, and then they became huge, and then they got tired of being hauled into hearings on Capitol Hill all the time, and they sort of say, okay, we'll just we'll engage in, we'll content moderate according to sort of PR to avoid shitstorms, basically, and then you have a constant changing of the red lines. Democrats are in power now, so we have to be sensitive to disinformation on COVID. Oh, Republicans are in power, so the red lines shift, or this we're getting pushback on this issue or that issue, and also Google was secretly working on a project to create a search engine for China, which would incorporate the dictate of the totalitarian party, basically. And I think ultimately money talks for these big tech companies. Even if I know several people who work there who have got good principles, and at the end of the day, they're in it for the money. And if that means limiting more free speech, then that's probably what they're going to do, and that will have huge consequences for all of us. And that's why I think decentralization is crucial.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting and enlightening discussion. And well, not discussion, I didn't really do any talking, did all the talking, and I really, really appreciate your expertise, and Town Hall for hosting us. Thank you so much for being with us, Jacob.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. And anyone has any follow-up, I'd love to continue the discussion online via email or social media or whatever. So thanks a lot.
Yes, Carolyn, thank you for leading this conversation. You did a lot of work. Don't discredit yourself.
Yeah, you did.
And I just asked questions.
Yes, and Jacob, you are not just a lawyer. You also don't discredit yourself. You're both doing great work. But Jacob, thank you so much for tuning in with us here at Town Hall. I know you're not here in Washington, but I feel you. I feel your energy, and thank you for being here with us and sharing your story. And I really appreciate it.
I really enjoyed it. So thanks a lot for having me.
Good. Yes, of course. And to my viewers at home, please remember to purchase a copy with our friends at Third Place Books, and that link can be found in the chat. Have a great night, everyone.